Welcome to Deep Dive, everyone. I'm Steve Hilton, and this is the home of Smart Conversation on the big issues. A big economic issue we're going to be covering today, one of the biggest of our time that has really become a big part of the political conversation. That is inequality, economic inequality. If you listen to Democrats and some on the right who may be in that more populist camp of political opinion, they would argue that economic inequality is the biggest issue of our time, the gap between the rich and the poor and those in the middle growing bigger and bigger, and that we need to do something about it. On the left, you've got a whole range of proposals in this 2020 election campaign that's taking shape that are basically targeting that wealth gap in different ways, from a straightforward wealth tax to taxes on inheritance, a whole set of ideas that we're going to be getting into, evaluating their effectiveness. But before that, I think it's important that we actually examine the core question and the assumptions underlying it, because there's some really interesting new ways of looking at the data around economic inequality that may make you question whether this really is the big issue that it's cracked up to be. So we're going to get into all of that with some great experts here. Steve Moore is a former senior economic advisor to Donald Trump and a distinguished visiting fellow for the Project for Economic Growth at the Heritage Foundation. Kayleigh McEnany is the National Press Secretary for President Trump's 2020 campaign, and John Grace is founder and president of Investors Advantage Corp and a registered principal at Securities America Financial Corporation. Right, so Steve, you and I touched on this the other day when we were talking, and you brought my attention to some very interesting number crunching done by Phil Gramm in the Wall Street Journal. Could you just lay out for us what he was saying there in that piece as a basis for our discussion?
Phil Gramm was a senator from Texas and also was an economist, and so he parsed through this data, and what he found, Steve, was that, if you just look at the incomes and not look at the effect of all the government spending programs, because we spent trillions of dollars on income transfer programs, and then if you look at the tax system, and it's highly skewed towards the wealthy, the top 1% pay more tax than the bottom 90%. What he found out was that there's a much more of a leveling of the income, and these disparities between the rich and poor, really, they don't disappear, but they're much less. And by the way, he found the lowest quintile, the people in the bottom fifth, the average income of them, when you include the government benefits they're getting, is $50,000. That's not very poor. I mean, that's rich in a lot of countries.
So basically, the numbers, because we hear all these numbers thrown around, particularly by Democrats, this widening gap, and the top whatever percent, I mean, pick whatever number you want, but they earn hundreds of times more. Their incomes are hundreds of times greater than those at the bottom. And even a few decades ago, it was only the kind of factor of multiplication was much lower. It was just 5 or 6 times. I think I'm right in saying that according to this Phil Gramm analysis, the actual difference was something in that area that people praise as a gold.
3.8%.
3.8%.
Yes, it was
the actual thing. Once you take into account the reduction in income of the richest through taxes, and the increase in the income through benefits for those at the bottom. Once you take all that into, the net effect is to crush the wealth gap down to 3.8%.
3.8%. It's extraordinary because, of course, the top half is paying 80% of the taxes, and the bottom half is receiving 70% of the benefits. So that evens out to where 3.8%, which is a pretty reasonable gap when you consider the amount of hours, for instance, being worked by the top half versus the bottom half, or the differing factors.
I think every reasonable person would say inequality is a natural byproduct of inequality of some kind of an open market economy.
The most interesting part, though, is the middle class getting crushed, because they are working. This is the second quintile. They're working more hours. They have more people working than the bottom quintile, but yet they're being crushed and only making 9% more than the bottom quintile. So it ends up harming the middle class. That's who gets hurt.
That's interesting. Do you share this analysis?
Well, I certainly see some of the points, but I see them quite a bit differently.
Okay.
One of the things that fascinates me is when we talk about, and as Steve has written about, how the income is booming. I just have to say, U.S. residents, U.S. citizens. Okay.
Across the board.
Across the board,
right?
Particularly the middle class, as he wrote.
That's just so we're clear what we're talking about. You're referring there to a piece that Steve wrote, looking at the Census Bureau numbers, looking at not the wealth gap, but just the increase in wealth under the Trump administration compared to previous administrations.
That's what he wrote about, and I just have
Which
to
I think,
say,
again, let's just get the numbers out there. I think I'm right in saying that when you looked at the numbers, the increase...
$5,000.
Well, let's just look at under President Bush, $400 up increase. Under President Obama, $1,000 for the average family. And under President Trump so far, $5,000. A huge difference. That's what Steve argued.
And I'm saying it's still inadequate. What I'm saying is, if you go back 10 years ago, the average household income in America was a whopping $57,000.
How many years ago?
10 years ago.
10 years ago.
That's correct.
It was $57,000.
That's right. And we actually
For the average or the median?
That's the median average income.
Well, they're not
Americans.
the same. So which was
median income for
median
Americans
income. Okay,
was
fine.
$57,000.
So that's again, just so we're clear about terms, the midpoint. So half of American families earn below that, and half in number earn above that. The midpoint.
Right. And just recognize, for 4 years we actually went into negative territory.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So there was a point in time where we were real close to $50,000.
Right.
So now being at $64,000, $65,000, it is not the same equivalent. In other words, housing has risen more dramatically. Cars have risen more dramatically in cost. The average car is now 33% more than it was 10 years ago. The average income is only 25% growth in terms of the average household income. So we're not back to even. And like I say, at the end of the day, whether you're in Ohio or New York or certainly Los Angeles, on $65,000, it's not a great life.
Because well, I've had this conversation over the years and talked about income stagnation. Until the last couple of years, actually, where you've seen you started to see significant increases, particularly at the lower end, where you look at people see the job numbers every month and the earnings report that goes with it, and they see for the last year or so we've been seeing pretty consistently a kind of 3% or so increase in earnings.
Wages.
But actually, that's the average across the whole income spectrum. When you look at the lower groups, it's like 7, 8, 9%.
Yes, actually, Wall Street Journal headline just about 2 or 3 months ago: the biggest wage gains in percentage terms have gone to the people at the bottom.
Right. But I wanted to make a different point, which is that that's happening very recently.
Yes.
We're seeing this increase,
and that's because of the tight labor market.
I mean, there were numbers that I remember looking at, being very shocked by, where you saw basically stagnation in earnings for I think the category here was roughly the 80% of, I think they were described as non-managerial workers, and so people who weren't in management positions and owners of businesses and so on. And the 80% or so of workers that represents, basically after taking account of inflation, income's almost a straight line, stagnant.
Over what period?
Since 1973.
Yeah.
So huge, long period until just recently. Now, when that conversation was going on, I remember putting that to people who would say, yeah, but over that time, so much got cheaper. Consumer goods got cheaper. The cost of living actually went down. And so actually the same amount of money buys you a lot more stuff.
I wish it were true.
Right.
But as I say, when an average car goes from $30,000 to $40,000, that's not a reduction. That's an increase, a significant one, just in the last 10 years. And if we go back 10 years, one of the things that I think is worth making sure we understand is what happened to the average household in terms of wealth. For Caucasians, I think the decline as of October 2009 was a whopping 16%. That's pretty easy to get back to even. For Latinos, I understand that the average was a decline of about 66%, and for African Americans, it's a decline of about 53%. Now, if you're down 60%, what do you need to get back to even? 150?
Right.
Who's done that? No one in those categories. So it's very depressed, and that has not really changed.
What do you blame?
That's from Pew Research.
Blame maybe the wrong term. To what do you attribute this?
Well, I don't know that there would be. To me, it's not political. To me, it's something that happens, and maybe it's something that we should be understanding, and then we look at to see what we can do.
People point to the two things that you most often hear put into the mix as causes are automation in the economy,
absolutely,
and globalization in terms of jobs and manufacturing and so on going to
Well,
China.
I think Andrew Yang made a good point in an interview after one of the debates, and he talked about what happened in Detroit. And there are those who would want us to believe that it was the immigrants who took the jobs, and he made it very clear that in his research it was technology that took the jobs away. Right. And I think more often than not that is the case. But when we make it other people, particularly other ethnic groups, it really throws a whole bunch of people under the bus, which I will
get to the technology in a second, because I'm very interested. follow very closely the work that Ivanka Trump is doing within this administration and on skills and trying to counteract some of that. But before we get to that, Steve, I just wanted your kind of broad view on this. You're arguing, or you're agreeing with Phil Graham's analysis that actually inequality is not nearly as big, the wealth gap not nearly as big as the political rhetoric of the left would suggest. Do you think it's still a problem, though?
I think we overstate this issue of income inequality. Look, what I care about is, as John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan used to say, let's create a rising tide that lifts all boats. And I think under Trump, that's what's happening. We're seeing all income groups benefit from this expansion. And part of the reason for that, Steve, is because we've created a really tight labor market. I mean, you report on this every week. Unemployment is so low, this has given workers more power to negotiate up their wages. That's why we did the plan, the tax reduction and the deregulation to give. That's what Donald Trump always said. He said, how do we get these wages up for middle-class workers? So I'm not quite as negative about some of these trends as you are. I mean, I agree there are certain problems out there, but I want to see policies from Democrats that all I'm hearing from the Democrats right now is sock it to the rich and give it to the poor. And income redistribution is not an economic growth plan. I want to hear some constructive ideas from the Democrats. What are you going to do to help, raise up those income levels of lower income?
Yes, I mean, that reminds me of the famous, when I was growing up in the UK, it was Margaret Thatcher. I'm sure others have said a version of this, which is that you don't make the poor richer by making the rich poorer.
Exactly, and even Elizabeth Warren is proposing this wealth tax, Bernie Sanders as well. Perhaps they should take advice from liberal economist Larry Summers, who says every 1% increase on income tax leads to a 0.6% decrease in tax revenue coming in. So
where's that from?
I read it in an article. I forget which.
Larry Summers. That's
Larry Summers, and he's a liberal economist. He has cited that, and with that data, you found that Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax doesn't bring in $2.8 trillion, as she says, but $1 trillion if you use the math Larry Summers has laid out.
By the way, on wealth tax, I mean, we have a real live experiment going on because in California, they've been doing something similar. And I think there's just from the Hoover Institution, I think at Stanford, they just published an analysis. It actually reduced the
They raised the income tax rate to 13.5%, and they actually got a lot less revenue than
this is real. This is
that's because wealthy people moved out. They moved to Florida or Texas or Tennessee, where you can pay. You're a Florida resident, you pay no income tax.
Or in France, where they lost 42,000 millionaires from their wealth tax.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think it's worth noting for 1962, when we look at the top 1% versus the bottom 99%, at that point it was pretty equal. 32, 34% was the share of wealth. By 2016, the top 1% is garnering over 40% of the wealth.
Yes.
And the bottom 90% is generating a whopping 20% of the wealth. So one has dramatically increased, and one is not.
Those are really big numbers. I mean, let's just have a look at those numbers because, there are even more extreme ways of making that point. I've heard Bernie Sanders, for example. I think he talks about the top 3 people, the richest 3 people in America owning more wealth than the bottom 90% or something like that. Really extreme contrast. We've talked about income. This is about wealth, how much you actually earn your assets and resources. Should we care about wealth?
Of course we should. Now, I have a proposal. I put this in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago that I think would be the single best thing we could do for lower income Americans to increase their wealth. Allow people to take the 10% Social Security tax rather than pay it into the government. Let them put that in a personally owned account so all Americans could own. And by the way, we've had a 50% increase.
A personal retirement.
Yeah, so it would be like a savings, like an IRA, but that 10%, instead of going into the black hole Social Security, would go into an account where they would, and you could put an index fund so they don't own all the stocks of American companies, and that way you'd have a share of the wealth. If the stock market goes up by 50%, as it has in the last 3 years, Americans would see a 50% increase.
Just to be clear, is that the proposal that, I wasn't here then, so forgive me if I'm
it's different from what Bush
Is it privatizing Social Security.
No. This is just basically saying you can have the option of taking that 10% of your paycheck. Because for low-income people, the number one tax they pay now is the payroll tax. You know that, Steve? Low-income people pay more payroll tax than they do income tax.
Well, that's why, I mean, you and I have talked about this before. I think, and you know, now we've got Katie here, we can sort of bend her ear about it with the campaign. Cutting the payroll tax, promising to do that, you need Congress, but, you know, making that a flagship commitment, I think is a very powerful message for the president.
Oh, it certainly is a powerful message, especially on the backs of the tax cuts that he's put out there already. What is an equally powerful message, though, I think, is what the Democrats want is not just wealth confiscation, but giving it to government, transferring this wealth to government who controls the taxpayers' dollars. And it's not the right answer. It's why 12 European countries who have put in place a wealth tax, of those 9 no longer have it. Only 3 do, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work in practice. It doesn't work handing government the reins of spending, as they've we blundered so much up to this point. And it's also arguably unconstitutional. Don't take that from me. Take it from 2 avowed liberals who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that it was an unconstitutional.
There's another aspect of the wealth tax. I'd love to get your take on this, which is that, and I've really, you know, this is reminding me so much of some of the debates back in the UK and when I was coming of age in politics in the sort of 90s, and you had the Labour Party trying to move away from some of its extreme high tax policy, a 98% income tax and so on, and trying to say, well, we've got these taxes are just for the rich, and they put in a threshold. Look, you have to earn, you know, £1 million, whatever, and so that's like it's only the rich that are going to pay. But what they found is that actually people hear that message, and even though they're not earning anything like $1 million, they kind of might like to one day, and they kind of think, well, actually they're targeting what I hope to become.
Good point.
And so I don't like the sound of this, and so it's not so it's a bit simplistic to say this is a safe message politically because only a handful of people are going to pay this tax. Many more are going to hear the message and think, that's not for me.
Well, and let's just be clear, the 1%ers are going to find a creative way not to pay the tax. I mean, they're smart people.
Exactly.
And they're going to find more private equity programs. They're going to put the money somewhere so that the government doesn't see it, at least just not right now. So they will certainly be incentivized to do everything they can to make sure the money isn't as visible as it has been in the past. But I mean, let's also understand that right now, a couple of things. One, we've got 50% of Americans who do not have a 401k, are not participating at all. So the market might be up 1,000%, but they're not participating at all. And so, that makes it very difficult. And there are a number of Americans who are suggesting at the personal level that they would like some kind of a government-imposed retirement plan because they know it will happen. Right now, we're all left on our own, and the truth is nobody's making contributions other than the rich.
So, Steve, we talk about, when we're in this conversation about income and inequality and so on, we talk about the 1%. They go all the time. We hear the 1%, the 1%. I mean, who are these people when we think about it? How should we think about them?
Great question, Steve. So we've got some really good analysis of what these people do. And there was a great book, by the way, about 20 years ago called The Millionaire Next Door, which became a big bestseller. And what they found in that book is, a lot of people think, oh, these are just people who inherited their money or they're clipping coupons. No, that's not true. The vast majority of people in the top 1%, you know what they do, Steve? They own, operate, or invest in small businesses.
Right.
They are the job creators and the wealth creators of our economy. I just don't like this wealth bashing that's going on out there. I mean, we obviously want to have this rising tide that lifts all boats, and as you said very well, I mean, this is an important point. My friend Art Lafroy says, you want a tax system that tries to make poor people rich, not make rich people poor. Sometimes I think some of my friends on the other side of the aisle have that wrong. But yeah, they create jobs, and they create, look at what Bill Gates and, a person like Jeff Bezos have done. They've created, hundreds and thousands of jobs. They've created many people, higher incomes. I hate this bashing of the rich.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point about small business. And it's interesting when you look at some of the items on the policy agenda of Democrats, both nationally and locally, small business are really hurt when they talk blithely about regulations and tax. It's small businesses that are the backbone of the economy, and they're going to be hurt.
And they were hurt by Obamacare, as we all know, with the employer mandate. Yep. So they are the ones that are hurt by this wealth tax. They're the ones who are hurt by all of the Democrats' regulations. But you make
and Medicare for all, especially.
Medicare
That's really a nightmare for small business.
Oh, it's a huge nightmare.
Yeah.
But you make a very good point that rather than demonizing the 1%, let's aspire to, give more people access to the American dream, which is happening under this president. When you cited that Wall Street Journal article, which I think was citing Goldman Sachs data, that income is going up by the fastest pace of 10 years, but twice as fast for low and middle income Americans. I think that's something we can all applaud, and it's happening because of the Trump.
Let me just add one other quick thing. That's something you said, Steve, that's absolutely true. You said it was true about Britain. That's also true in the United States. We've been doing polling, now our group, but there's been a lot of polling on how people feel about the estate tax. And by the way, the estate tax only affects about one out of 100 Americans. And yet, every poll for the last 25 years has shown about two out of 3 Americans are against the death tax, even though most of them are never going to pay it.
Yeah.
And the reason is we're an aspirational country in the United States.
Yeah.
And people realize, wait a minute, my ship comes in, and I got rich. I don't want the government taking half of it away from me.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think those 2 points go together. That kind of that idea of aspiration and opportunity working together. And I think the one thing I think we can't deny is that over the course of the last decade or so, since the Great Recession, although some ways of looking at the numbers are that it's a much more long-standing problem, there is this sense, that's palpable that something's really gone wrong, and that connection between working hard and getting rewarded seems to have been broken for a lot of people, and that explains a lot of the political turmoil you're seeing, and this kind of shaking up of the establishment has been widely reported, both here in the US, not just with President Trump, with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and that rise of that populist movement, same in the UK with Brexit, and all over the world, that sense that there's a sort of unfairness. I think that the crucial factor here is not so much the incomes of the people at the top. It's that sense that you can climb the ladder of opportunity. If you think you've got a fair shot, then you're okay with it. You know that there are always going to be rich people, and you kind of want to climb the ladder, and that's fine. I think people feel that has broken a bit, but that's why I think policies that free up small business, that improve schools, and give people a better chance, that's the key to some of it.
One quick thing is just I get so excited when I go to these various rallies of the presidents because I get to look into the state data, and it is an exciting day when every single state I look at, it's 100,000 plus coming off of food stamps, 20,000 being lifted off of poverty in a given state, and it is every state that we go to that I see this data, people coming out of poverty, people coming off of food stamps, because Americans want to work, they want opportunity, they don't want handouts, they want a hand up, and I think that it's happening every day in this presidency.
So I can feel you're saying, that's all a bit rose-tinted, but I feel like, and you've made that point before, so what I'd love you to do is set up maybe some of the things you'd like to see happen. What's on your list, your wish list of policy changes?
Well, if we like the idea of all boats rising on a rising sea, I think part of it has to be the communication that is possible. And right now, I think a lot of people feel that's impossible. And when you look at the average wealth of the average Black American family, it's all of $17,000. Okay, the average for the country is 97. For Caucasian, it's 171, and for Latinos, it's 22. 10 times. That's a huge difference. So, a lot of people are just not feeling like they're able to join the party, and I think we should all make them welcome, no matter where they came from, how long they've been here, or how they got here. Let's make them welcome. We need them. If you look at Maine as an example, right now, imagine you have relatives in Maine, and you have, they're elderly, but they have health care and they have insurance and they have cash. But guess what they cannot find in Maine anymore? People to do the job, to take care of the parents with the capability. All the young people have been moving out of Maine. I'm submitting that's going to be a precursor as far as the country is concerned, and we need to allow for immigration in a way that can help us get the jobs that we need to have done, that our kids are not going to do and we're not going to do.
If I could just add one optimistic point, though, about Black Americans in particular. I mean, lowest poverty rate in the history of the country under this presidency. 350,000 Black Americans lifted out of poverty. Median household income for this community, the highest it's been since 2001. There are some really positive signs that were not happening under Obama that are happening under President Trump.
And I would disagree. They started in 2008, 2009 at the very bottom. And let's recognize that the decline of average wealth in this country for Black Americans, if I'm not mistaken, Pew Research, this is the source, 53%. For Latinos, 66%. For white people, 16%. I mean, you just can't make those all the same.
Well, you also can't make up historic lows in unemployment and historic lows in poverty, and they're better off today. The Hispanic community, the Black community, the disabled, veterans, under today.
They will not agree with
you. You asked about, what policies could we do. I think the single most important policy we could do to help low income, especially African Americans and Hispanics in inner cities, is something President Trump wanted to do that got shot down by Democrats, which is give every single Black child in a failing school district a scholarship or voucher to go. I had the advantage of going to a good school.
Yeah,
you probably had
a voucher to.
And pardon?
A voucher to.
A voucher. Make it $12,000 and pick a good school. I mean, that would be so great for kids.
I think that if you want, this is what drives me crazy about this whole conversation on the left, right? So Elizabeth Warren wants to raise all this money, right? And then what's she going to do with that? Okay, forget about whether or not you'll actually get that amount of money because the impact on incentives and people leaving and evasion and avoidance and whatever. Let's just say she gets the money. What's she going to do with the money? She's going to, as you put, she's going to give it to the state, and she's giving it to public sector union-controlled parts of the state, right?
Yeah.
And including to failing public schools that keep people trapped in poverty. And actually, what's really interesting is that just looking anecdotally at some of the places, it's African American families that are most passionate about trying to get that kind of school choice.
Exactly.
We saw it in Florida with the vote for Ron DeSantis.
Yes.
You see it right here. We're in Los Angeles. It was very interesting. You have the NAACP. There are real defections from their national position here in Los Angeles because they were against school choice nationally. And here in Los Angeles, they were saying, no, we want it, because for our families right here, that's what we need.
And we do. We all do. No question.
And I think that is a way to help with this issue long term.
How many kids you could...
The other thing, I just wanted to...
$600 billion, sorry, that... Think you could provide every child in America in a low-income area a voucher for, say, $10,000, $15,000.
I mean, the sad thing is there's a limit to what can be done. I mean, it's mostly run at the state level. So, I mean, it's very hard to... I want to bring in one other thing I mentioned earlier, which is about I guess the next stage of education, which is training and skills.
Yeah.
And actually, to your point about, it's true that the gap between job vacancies and number of people is actually really big. There's kind of a huge gap there right now. In other words, jobs are there and people don't have the skills to take them. The administration is doing something about it. Ivanka Trump, who I've interviewed a couple of times on The Next Revolution on my Fox News Channel show, what she's doing there, working with the private sector to get them to make commitments to incorporate training and reskilling for their current workforce and also for people on the sidelines. That's really important. I mean, it's one of those issues that people, their eyes slightly glaze over, training, whatever, but it's really important.
Well, college is not for everyone, and let's just be honest. College is, it's ridiculous how much money we spend for college, and we're not getting a good education. What you're buying is the brick and mortar and the nice professors and the magnificent facility. You can pay a whole lot more than a less costly college, but as I say, you're not getting a better education. Yeah. So, I would submit that when it comes to health care and college costs, that the primary reason, again, it's not political as far as I'm concerned, the primary reason both of those need to be reworked 100%. It's because we have no globalization, we have no competition. Everything else, every place else where we have competition, costs have come down. And the places that are exclusive to the U.S. of A., okay, with our exuberance, right, the costs have gone through the roof.
Great point.
Much above inflation.
I talk about that all the time in my speeches. The two industries in the United States, you're spot on correct. Over the last 10 or 20 or 50 years, the two industries that have had the most, by far the most rapid rise in inflation are education and healthcare, the two industries that are run by government. I ask my liberal friends, why does the government play such a big role in healthcare and education? They say to make it more affordable. Gee, they're doing a great job of it, aren't they?
All right. Well,
unbelievable. I would just say it's competition. It's more.
Yeah, you've got to add more competition in healthcare, add more competition in education, you'll get better results.
Absolutely. So look at that. We've covered a lot of ground. We're nearly at the end. Kaylee, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, I would just say, look, what Ivanka Trump is doing is making a difference. I talked to carrier manufacturing workers who almost lost their job. President Trump saved their jobs in the interim between the two administrations. But they said to me, look, you've got to have someone to run the machines that are coming in. You've got to have someone to fix them. Train us to fix them. We want the skills. And that is what Ivanka Trump has really heralded. And
I think that, what that shows you is that the promise that Donald Trump made as a candidate to be a pro-worker president, it is showing up in these ways that don't get quite so much attention. We hear the drumbeat of the lowest African American unemployment, the lowest Hispanic unemployment, the historic 50-year low overall unemployment, the highest employment. We hear that every month. You've got the jobs report, but that detailed work on skills really long-term can make a big difference, and you don't hear about that so often. But I just want to thank you all for a great conversation. We really did get into a lot of the issues. I'm not sure we've solved all the problems of the modern economy. Exactly, next time. And do please join us next time for the next deep dive. That'll be here on Fox Nation tomorrow at noon.